Proverbs 17, verse 1. Better is a dry morsel, and quietness therewith, than a house full of sacrifices with strife. Now again, as I mentioned last Sunday, it has this word better, and almost all the times that I've seen so far where the Bible talks about it's better to have this than that, it's always talking about wealth. And here it says, you're better off having a dry morsel, a dry, crusty piece of bread, than to have a house full of sacrifices. Remember, sacrifices are the cream of the crop, and most of them were meat. So a picture, you can have a house full of meat, lovely steak and lobster and shrimp. Actually, lobster and shrimp wouldn't have been sacrifices, but you get the idea. The best choice cuts of meat, you could eat that or have just a little piece of dry, expired bread. What would you rather? Well, of course, we'd rather the meat. But here it says, you're better off having the bread if the meat comes with strife. If having a wealthy house comes with difficulties, strife, division, fightings, you're better off being poor. Do you understand? So, of course, it's not better to be poor than to be rich. But it's not good to be rich if you're going to pay the price of losing your peace and joy to get it. Being poor is better if it means having peace than being rich and not having peace. All the money in the world is not going to mean anything to you if you've lost your happiness and joy and peace. So it's better. Money basically is not a good thing to strive after, is what this is getting at. It is a very bad master. So in verse 2 it says, a wise servant shall have rule over a son that causes shame, and shall have part of the inheritance among the brethren. So you've got a servant and you've got a son, both in the house, but the servant has earned the trust of the father. He's a diligent servant, and this proverb gives us the encouragement that diligence is rewarded. Now that's not absolute, because people are flawed. Sometimes we work hard and our hard work goes unnoticed, but that's not the general way things are. Generally, what the Bible is getting at is diligence is rewarded. In fact, diligence is more important than status. The son has the status. The servant does not. But the son does not receive the place of blessing that even the servant does, because the servant is diligent, and the son who causes shame actually loses that blessing. So diligence is rewarded, and the same thing, I would say, if you're relying on your status, that's not enough. It's not going to cut it. It gives you an advantage or a head start, but it won't pull you through. Who you are is not really what matters, but what you do is what matters. In verse 3, the refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tries the heart. You've got silver, gold, and a heart. Silver is refined, and it says the refining pot, and the furnace refines gold. So, what refines the heart? The Lord. So when you refine silver, it becomes more pure, more precious. You remove the imperfections, and it becomes more valuable. It looks more beautiful. Same with gold. Gold, when it's raw and imperfect, it doesn't look as special. But once you put it through the refining process, man, it comes out looking beautiful. And God's saying he does that with our hearts. Do you know God actually he puts your heart into a place of refining. Refining is uncomfortable. Actually, the process of refining requires burning and melting and removing. Burning and melting and removing are not comfortable for us. God's going to burn you. He's got to melt you down, and he's got to remove things from your life in order for your heart to become purified. God wants to purify your heart. He wants to purify us. He wants to make you something beautiful on the inside. This is the heart he's speaking of. He wants to make your heart beautiful, the desires of your heart, who you are on the inside. He's got to work to make you beautiful. But that process is not comfortable. So let the Lord do his work. But understand too, just because hardships come does not mean that's a bad thing. The hardship, like if God's going to refine you, it is going to require hardship. No refining, you can't have refining otherwise. Ask the gold, would you like to be purified without the furnace? I'm sure the gold would say, yes, please. But it's just not possible. You can't remove the imperfections without the adversity. And so it is with us. So don't get discouraged. Don't get cast down when life is hard. The Lord is going to refine your heart. Seek him through it. Turn to him and let him melt you down, burn out all those things that are not of him, and remove those imperfections. In verse 4, it says, a wicked doer gives heed to false lips, and a liar gives ear to a naughty tongue. Now, wickedness and lying, they feed each other in a vicious cycle. It says, the one who does wicked deeds, he gives heed to false lips. Okay? The one who does evil deeds is likely to tell lies. And it says, a liar gives ear to a naughty tongue. The liar is prone to speak things that he ought not to speak. And so, when you do wickedly, it can result in lying, and lying can result in you doing wickedly, and wickedly can result in you lying, and lying results in you doing wickedly, and it's a vicious cycle. It's a cycle of sin. And so we need to break that cycle. The opposite of these are truth and righteousness, and they put a stop to it. I just want to paint a picture to you, okay? Say, think back to when you were a child, okay? And you did something you shouldn't have. Now, maybe it was you took some food when it wasn't mealtime and you weren't supposed to do that, took a cookie out of the cookie jar. Maybe you hit one of your siblings. Well, hitting your sibling probably wouldn't work because somebody would tattle on you. But you did something and nobody saw it and it was wrong. And you're caught for it. But you lie about it to get yourself out of trouble. You see, you've done something wrong, and now the temptation is to lie to get yourself out of the hardship. But that's a cycle. You see, the wicked deed resulted in a lying tongue. And this is a cycle we get into when we're in sin. That cycle needs to be broken because that cycle won't end. It will just keep going. You'll just become more wicked and lie more and manipulate more, and it will destroy you. So we need to put an end to it with righteousness and truth. Don't tolerate wickedness and lying. Don't say, I'll just do it this once. It's a cycle. It will catch hold of you. You're not really in control when this happens. It's pulling you in. Now, in verse 5, it says, whoever mocks the poor reproaches his maker, and he that is glad at calamities shall not be unpunished. Be careful not to rejoice when somebody is going through a hard time. Do not rejoice over somebody's downfall. When somebody you don't like is having a hard time, you be careful that you don't rejoice over it. Because the Lord here is displeased with that. It says, whoever is glad at calamities will not be unpunished. You might see somebody you don't like. Even you might have reason not to like them. And they are reaping the consequences of their actions. And in your heart, you know what you feel? I'm happy. I'm happy that they're reaping the consequences of their actions. Finally, they deserve it. Do you know what? God says you will be punished if you think that. You will be punished if you think that. Here's a sad reality. God does judge people. And you can have somebody who's wronged you. God is going to be just. He's going to execute vengeance on that person. But if God executes vengeance on that person and you witness it, and in your heart you go, I'm glad about it. Do you understand? God is grieved. He doesn't want to punish people. If you're glad about it, God actually now will judge you for that. How sad. Now God is going to judge two people over something God never wanted to happen. But God will judge you. Do not rejoice in your heart. Do not gloat in your heart over other people's demise. In fact, actually, I think it's another proverb. We'll probably get to it later on. But God talks about if you see somebody being judged justly and you rejoice over it, God is actually going to turn that punishment away from them and turn it toward you. He'll actually pull back away from judging them at that point and turn it towards you. We actually see an example of this in our evening study in Ezekiel. But you'll have to see that tonight when we come through Ezekiel. But we see the example of somebody who God used in judgment, and then he turned around and judged that person because they gloated. Now we come to verse 6. Verse 6 says, children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. Now you get old. Grandpas in this room. Don't you know it? Your grandchildren are your pride and joy, aren't they? Your grandchildren are your pride and joy. Children's children are the crown of old men. They are a crown. Unfortunately, if your grandchildren are rebels and fools, then it's not very much of a crown. But especially a child who causes joy and is respectful, what a crown it is to you. It brings joy to your heart. And there is no, as a dad, you become a grandfather, and then you get to witness your grandchildren. The Bible seems to suggest this is one of the greatest crowns a man can achieve. Now think about this, men in the room. Okay, you can build a big business. You could become a multi-millionaire. You could marry the finest woman around. But none of that is going to matter as much as your grandchildren. When you become old, your grandchildren are going to be your crown, okay? Your wife, you're going to love her, but when she gets old too, she won't be so much of a crown and beauty anymore, will she? Right? Beauty fades, right? It's just the way of life, okay? Your job, you might make a multi-million-dollar business. That can get taken away from you. And even when you're old, guess what? Money doesn't really matter. You're going to lose that money when you die. But here's the point. A legacy that is left behind is the true crown to a man. So men, you got to be thinking about this. Now this, of course, has connections to women, but especially men, you've got to be thinking about this. You are going to leave a legacy, and you're not going to go down in the history books. None of us are going to go down in the history books. Nobody's going to remember us in 100 years from now. But you are going to leave a legacy that will be remembered. Though your name will pass away, it will be remembered by your grandchildren and maybe your great-grandchildren, and that will leave an effect. It can change the course of history, even though your name might be forgotten and will be forgotten. Nearly all of our names are going to be forgotten within even 10, 20 years after we pass. I know that's a morbid, a somber reality, but that's just the reality, the way things work. So if that's the case, what are you building for? You should be thinking of the legacy that you're going to leave behind. And it reverses it to say, the glory of children of their fathers. The glory of children of their fathers. If the glory of old men is their grandchildren, the glory of children of their fathers, children look up to their dads. They do. In fact, when your children are small, like my children are, it's so easy right now because they look up to you like you're everything. They are a father who does well. A child boasts in their dad. They boast in them. The father is a glory to their children. They're proud of their dad. They respect their dad. Now, as they get older, of course, we understand they have to learn to make their own decisions. And sometimes they distance themselves a bit. That happens partially. But with children, the father is the glory of a child. So there's a big responsibility on fathers. This is especially directed to fathers. But of course, we understand the impact of parents in general through this passage. In verse 7, it says, excellent speech becometh not a fool, much less do lying lips a prince. Now remember, the prince is speaking of a ruler. Prince here does not mean the same as in the monarchy that we have, Prince Charles, who's become King Charles. What's the difference? He was prince simply because he wasn't king. That's all prince, at least to my knowledge, all that prince really means is he's got a right to the throne maybe at some point, but he's not king yet. But that's not what prince means in the Bible. In the Bible, prince means ruler. So you could put that word ruler in. Excellent speech does not become a fool, is not becoming of a fool, and much less do lying lips a prince. Okay, if you look at a fool, fools do not speak with excellent speech. If you see a fool and they're speaking with excellent speech, do you know what? You know they're up to something that's not good. Because they don't speak with fine speech. If they do, they're trying to manipulate. They're trying to use you. And it actually shows they're up to no good, right? And it says here in the same way, okay? When you see a fool using fine speech, you know something does not fit in here. They're up to no good. When it's even worse, when a prince, when a ruler is lying to the people, that is far worse. If you're worried about a fool using fine speech, as I don't know what they're up to, I'm worried about this. Be cautious. We ought to be more cautious when our rulers are lying to us. It is terribly inappropriate, isn't it? There should be transparency. Now, we all know there's plenty of lies going around. And unfortunately, our rulers are not very transparent. In fact, even if they were, it would be hard to know it because there's so many lies. And now we're on these devices all the time, and we hear so many things. Like even just take the recent example of the assassination attempt of Donald Trump in the States. Just take that for example. So many ideas come out. Was it on purpose? Was it an inside job? Was it just a fluke? Was it terrible negligence? What was it? It's hard to know what's true because we don't get transparency, do we? So maybe you and I can never know the difference. But this is a word, at least for our rulers. It is terribly inappropriate for our rulers to lie. So we need righteous rulers who are not going to lie, that will speak the truth. We need to pray for these rulers. Doesn't it almost seem impossible to find them? But we need to pray for this. In verse 8 it says, a gift is a precious stone in the eyes of him that has it. Whithersoever it turneth, it prospers. Now the word gift here is actually speaking of a bribe. It's talking about giving something to somebody, not in the way that we would give maybe Christmas gifts, no strings attached, right? When you give Christmas gifts, there are no strings attached, right? That's generally what we mean by a gift. If you give a gift expecting a gift, there's strings attached. But here, the gift is speaking of actually a bribe. It's a way to influence. And it's saying here, the gift is like a precious stone. This precious stone is like a talisman or a crystal that you can look into to produce good fortune. Okay, there are such things, and people use them today, and they are in the realm of witchcraft. We ought not to dabble in things like that. It's a good way to bring curses and judgment on yourself if you do. Don't dabble in that. But there are actual forces of power at work in the world that can predict future events, or at least with some degree of certainty, and be able to produce a measure of prosperity in your life. And God's warned us not to go there. We need to go to God and do things his way. And so it's giving this connection. Okay, if you have a bribe in your hands, you've got something that you can give to influence matters. It is like a magic crystal in the ability to influence. Now, it doesn't say whether this is good or bad. We would tend to think that this is bad. But at least understand the concept. If you've got means to give a gift, you've got power to influence something. Makes sense, doesn't it? Now, bribes are generally seen as a bad thing. And we're going to see, as we come through the proverb, how it becomes a bad thing. But at least understand the principle here. If you've got nothing to give, you don't have power to influence. But if you've got lots to give, if you've got lots of money and wealth, and you're able and willing to use that wealth to influence things, it has great power. Understand that wealth has great power to influence greedy people. If you have great wealth, you can use it to influence. Now, think about this as a Christian. If you're a Christian with money, think about it. How do we redeem this concept? Understanding the nature of money and the power that comes with it. How can we use money wisely? How can I use my money to influence this world in a way that is good, right, true, and produces a good outcome? Because it actually does have power. Now, we've got to use it very carefully, as we can see, because we can use bribery in all sorts of wicked ways. But this proverb is just getting at the fact that there's power in it. It has power to move greedy hearts. Hearts who want money and gain, you can actually influence them through bribes. In verse 9, he that covers a transgression seeks love, but he that repeateth a matter separateth close friends. Here it tells us that gossip comes from hateful hearts. Hearts that are filled with hate overflow with speech that is gossip. Hearts that are full with love do not spew out gossip. They do not spew out slander. And so the one who covers a transgression, it shows us that he is actually filled with love. When you see somebody and there's a flaw, the person who loves them, if you love that person, you're going to want to cover over that flaw. You're going to want it not to stick out. Maybe in your strength, you want to help them in their weakness, to build them up so that they don't stay in a dark place if it's a sin. Or maybe it's just an imperfection, and you want to, in a way, support them and help make them look better. We don't want to bring people down. We want to lift people up, prefer them over ourselves. That is a heart of love. So when you see somebody make a mistake, you don't jump all over them. You want to give them grace, and you want to give them mercy. That is the heart of love. But it says, whoever repeats a matter separateth close friends. Now, I find it interesting here, and we can interpret this as being gossip. But it uses the word repeats. You learn something that is flawed, because the whole world is flawed, and every one of us are flawed. And you learn something about somebody that's flawed, and you just have to tell somebody. You have to tell somebody. You have to tell your friends. You have to tell strangers. You have to tell your spouse. You can't just let it go and say, you know what, that's unfortunate. I'm gonna wash it out, or maybe I'll just pray for that person. But you got to tell somebody. That's what repeating is. You're repeating something that's been wronged, a wrong that has been done, a flaw that has been witnessed, and now you're spreading this everywhere. And this does not come from a heart of love. It comes from actually a hateful heart, a heart that looks down on your neighbor, that you think of yourself as being better than them. And so this is where this comes from. In verse 10, it says, a reproof enters more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a fool. And I'm going to read this one with verse 12, because these two verses go together. In verse 12, it says, let a bear robbed of her whelps meet a man rather than a fool in his folly. So these two verses tell us something. The fool is stubborn. A fool is hard. Okay, it says if there was a wise person, you could reprove that person, as in you could correct them. Say, look, what you're doing it's not right, and let me explain to you the right way. And the wise person is going to go, okay, do tell. Let me think about what you have to say. I want to listen because I want to grow. That's the wise person. But the fool, it says, not only will he not listen to reproof, the only way to get to a fool is to beat him. And if you're going to act like a fool, expect a beating. You're going to beat a fool because that's the only way he's going to understand. And even after beating the fool, he's going to understand the consequences of his action far less than the wise person who has just been reproved. So you see how far apart the fool and the wise are in humility? And in verse 12 it says, let a bear robbed of her whelps meet a man rather than a fool in his folly. How many of you, when walking down a trail, want to run into a bear? How many of you, when walking down a trail, want to run into a bear cub? I'm more scared of bear cubs than a bear. How many of you, though, want to walk down a trail and see a mama bear and a dead bear cub beside you? Okay, that would probably be the most terrifying thing I could ever think of. Because if that happens, you're a dead person, for sure. That mama bear is going to charge you because she's just been robbed of her cub, and she's going to think anything is a threat, and she's going to think you're the one who did it. She's going to charge you, and nothing is going to stop her. This picture here of a bear robbed of her whelps, and coming across a bear robbed of her whelps, shows us the passion and brutish, irrational, unstoppable nature of a bear in this instance. And get the connection. You're better off running into that bear robbed of her whelps than running into a fool in their foolishness. A fool in their foolishness is more passionate, brutish, irrational, and unstoppable than a bear robbed of her cubs. That's what it's saying. How dangerous a fool is. Now, it's not always easy to spot it. We don't intuitively run away from people in the same way we would a bear, because a bear it threatens your body and your life. But it is telling us the danger of a fool, but the nature of a fool. As surely as you'll never get that bear to stop, you'll never get that bear to slow down. You're never going to get a fool to stop once they're in their foolishness. You're never going to get them to turn around. They're so focused. They're so irrational and unstoppable in what they're doing. Now, I want to remind you what the fool is, because we got to understand what this is talking about. This is not talking about every person who doesn't know Jesus. That's not the case. Not every person who is a sinner is a fool. That's not the case. In fact, I would probably argue most of them are not. The fool, according to Jesus, is somebody who hears the word of God and doesn't do it. The wise person is somebody who hears the word of God and does it. The fool hears it and doesn't do it. The fool knows what's right. They hear it, have heard the truth, but they have distorted it. They've got their own views. They've got their own agendas. And I want to read to you a quote from G.K. Chesterton. Anybody familiar with G.K. Chesterton? Nobody. Great. My wife does because she knows me. But anyway, G.K. Chesterton is a well-respected author. You should read his books. But anyway, he says this: the modern world is not evil. In some ways, the modern world is far too good. It is full of wild and wasted virtues. When a religious scheme is shattered, it is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose, and they wander and do damage. But the virtues are let loose also. And the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Do you get the quote? He's actually making the argument that, look, we can look at all the sin, right? The rampant sexuality, drug abuse and addiction, alcoholism, right? All the crime. We can look at all that and say, that's bad. You know what he's getting at, though? Our modern world is far worse, not because of all these vices, but because of the good Christian virtues that God has taught that have been ripped out of the Bible, isolated, and weaponized. I want to give you just one example today of this, okay? And there are so many examples we could give, but if I gave all these examples, each one of these examples would require me to preach a whole sermon on it and perhaps a series of sermons exposing how this is wrong. I'm only going to give you one because I think it's probably the most powerful that all of us could probably relate to. And it's the example of what's happening in the world today with the love is love movement. You're familiar with the love is love movement? And it goes right along with what we call a woke ideology, which is a redefinition of what love means and what sexuality is. To mean, if I love, I can love anybody I want. I can have sex with whoever I want, man with man, woman with woman, adult with child, because that's part of it. You understand? I can do this with whoever I want because I love. Notice, there's a virtue of love. Do you hear the virtue? Love is a virtue. Love is a good thing. But that virtue, love, has been divorced from its biblical context of truth. And so, even though it's a good virtue, it has gone mad. And it no longer means what it meant to mean. Do you understand? Do you understand the example? It's not true anymore. It's not true love. It's totally distorted because it is void of everything else the Bible teaches. This is what G.K. Chesterton gets to, okay? And this is the picture of the Proverbs in 10 and 12. Especially 12, where it says, let a bear robbed of her whelps meet a man rather than a fool in his folly. The fool in his folly is a person who has a knowledge of the truth, but it has been divorced from the whole counsel of God's word. It has been ripped out of context. It has been distorted, twisted, and there is now a vehement attachment to their worldview. They will not abandon it. This is the fool. The fool will not listen. The fool will not heed wise counsel. They will not listen to rebuke. They will not humble themselves. And the Bible is saying, look, the fool in his folly is unstoppable. You're not going to change their mind. You're not going to stop them. Now, God has power to affect them, but you're not going to stop them. This is the point. You're better off getting out of the way and avoiding such persons. Now, we don't mean don't be kind to people and don't evangelize them. That's not what we're saying. What we're talking about is, in your life, understand that you're not going to convince them otherwise because they're not listening. They're irrational and unstoppable. Another quote from C.S. Lewis. How many of you know C.S. Lewis? Good. Okay. You're familiar with this author. He says, and this is along the same lines, the most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them, being the impulses, which we will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. There can be something which you intuitively know, this is good. Even the Bible might say this is good. But if you set this up as the ultimate principle for everything, inevitably it will reach a point where it will go off the tracks. This is what he's saying. And it will actually turn us into, he says devils. He's using that as an example, saying we will become wicked people. We will become like fools. Okay, you've got to have wisdom. Okay, even any biblical virtue must be seen in the context of the Bible and understand the whole counsel of God. You with me? You see what the proverb is saying? In verse 11 it says, and so we track back one verse because I skipped over it. The evil man seeks only rebellion. Therefore a cruel messenger shall be sent against him. And in verse 13, whoever rewards evil for good, evil shall not depart from his house. These two verses go together. And verse 11 shows us that God grants demons permission to torment those who are rebellious. That's what an evil messenger, a cruel messenger is. It's a demon. And God says here, an evil man seeks only rebellion. And God will actually send a demon against him to torment him. Now, there's an example in the Bible of this happening. There's actually more than one, but there's one very clear, obvious, spelled out example. And it's the example of King Saul. You all familiar with King Saul, David and Saul? King Saul disobeyed God. He rebelled against God. And God actually told Saul, your rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Take note, rebellion is like witchcraft, and it incurs the same punishment. But he rebelled against God, and so God sent, it tells us literally in the Bible, God sent an evil spirit from his presence to torment Saul. And so much so that David had to come and play music to soothe the spirit that was tormenting Saul. Now, I don't know what the torment looked like, but the Bible tells us that this happened. It could have been a mental anguish. Maybe it very likely was that caused a depression or an anxiety in his heart that tormented him day and night and never gave him any peace. And there was no reprieve until David played his music and it would soothe him. That's a very clear example of what happens here. In fact, I think this is the example Solomon, who's writing these things, is thinking of. Because remember, Solomon's dad is David, and David was the one who played for Saul. So you get this picture. Saul's rebelled against God. What's the consequence? God sends a demon to torment him. Okay? This is not cruel of God. This is called a curse. This is called a curse, and this is what a curse is. In the Bible are blessings and curses. A blessing means grace from God to prosper you. If God blesses your health, what we mean is God is prospering your health. He's making you healthy. If we say God's blessing your finances, we mean God is prospering you financially, and we thank God for it. But what is a curse? The curse is the opposite. It is God giving permission for demons to harm you. And when we do evil, we open ourselves up to curses, and this is just one of those. It is a curse of rebellion. When we rebel against God, God doesn't want you to rebel. He doesn't want you to be tormented. But when you do sin, when you rebel, you make an agreement with the devil, and you break your agreement with God. And that agreement opens up a door that Satan can now come and torment you. That's the way things are. It's the way the world is. And until the Lord comes again and destroys Satan into the lake of fire forever, until it happens, this is going to be the way it is. It's a warning against rebellion, but it teaches us the nature of blessings and curses. Now we come down to verse 14. The beginning of strife is as when one letteth out water. Therefore, leave off contention before it be meddled with. Think of a dam that's holding back the water. Once you let that water out, you can't get it back in. So don't start fights. We can all start fights, but you can't end it and you can't fix it. So be careful before you enter a conflict. Think twice about which hills we're going to die on, because we might just die. In verse 15, he that justifies the wicked and he that condemns the just, even they both are abomination to the Lord. Now here's I would caution with this parable. It's showing us about, be careful if you call evil good and good evil, right? But as I was reading this, I was just thinking about how sometimes we like to play devil's advocate. Where we like to, you might hear something that sounds right, but you like to think of all the ways that person might be wrong. Watch out, okay? I mean, even in the saying devil's advocate, something just doesn't sound right, does it? Okay? We should not be advocating for the devil. He does not need you to advocate for him. In fact, it will do no good. But this idea of devil's advocate, where you're fighting against something that's true just to poke holes and see if it will stand, or criticizing somebody who's right. Criticizing them, they might be right in 95%, but you gotta expose that 5% they're wrong. Now, sometimes iron sharpens iron, we understand, but be careful of a critical spirit and always jumping on people for doing things wrong. You know what? Maybe they did something different than the way you would. It doesn't necessarily mean it was wrong, but here it says, he that justifies the wicked, as in you approve of wicked behavior. You let it go. Maybe you don't say, oh, they're right, but you say, I'm fine with it. You're letting it go. You justify the wicked, and you're condemning the just. You're hard on those who are righteous, but you give a free pass or an easy pass to those who are wicked. God says this is an abomination. In verse 16, wherefore is there a price in the hand of a fool to get wisdom, seeing he has no heart to it? And he gives us this picture of there's a fool in his hand, he's got money, and he's going to buy wisdom. And he's scratching his head, Solomon is scratching his head going, why does a fool have money to go buy wisdom? Now, you can't use money to buy wisdom. Literally, like you can't purchase wisdom, but you can purchase things that might give you wisdom. But he's saying, why does a fool have money in his hand to go buy wisdom? He has got no heart to receive it. So maybe the fool is thinking, I am going to use my money to gain the blessings of wisdom. But if he would just pursue wisdom with his heart, he wouldn't have to go buy it. And if you buy it and your heart's not changed, what good is it to you? It's not going to be any use to you. Now, I think of people who spend their money on education. I think of people who will spend thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars going to an institute to learn things, to gain wisdom, but in their heart they've never learned to humble themselves. It's like, what's the point of it? Why would you spend all this money to gain wisdom when you've not learned the first things to humbling your heart? That's where we should start. And when we can humble our heart, then we can receive also the wisdom that God has to give us. Now we come down to verse 17. 17 and 18 go together. It speaks of friendship. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. A man void of understanding strikes hands and becomes surety in the presence of his friend. So a friend loves at all times. It never ends. A true friend always loves. And if you've got a friend and they love you some days and they don't the next, they're not actually a friend. You might call them a frenemy. They're not a friend, though, because a true friend loves at all times. That's how you know a true friend. They've always got your back. You know what? I've got friends who I don't see very often. I don't. But they're still my friends because whenever we're together, and even when we're not together, I know they've got my back. And some of them are from the days back when we were in Bible school. They'll be a friend forever. They'll never end to be a friend. Friendship doesn't matter the amount of time you spend together. It's a quality. A friend loves at all times. I still think of my friends, some which I haven't seen in a couple of years. I still think of them and pray when the Lord puts them on my mind. A friend loves at all times. A brother is born for adversity. That means there's tough times. When tough times come upon you, that's what a brother is there for. A brother is there with you through the thick and the thin. Now in verse 18 though, it says, a man void of understanding strikes hands and becomes surety or a guarantor or a cosigner in the presence of his friend. These two verses go together because it's saying a friend loves all the time. A brother is there with the difficulty, there with you. But a fool enters into debt with his friend. Do you notice that? Those almost seem to be opposites. Because we might think, if I have a friend and I care about him and he's come across hard times, I'll loan him some money, help him out. Or I'll co-sign for him on that loan, give him a hand, right? That's what friends do. Only a friend who has no understanding is what this Bible tells us. A friend who is empty of understanding. A friend who knows nothing might do that. But a friend who is wise will not do that. Because here's the thing. When you go into debt with somebody, it changes the relationship. When you loan money to somebody, your relationship with that person changes. In fact, it's bad advice. I give this as bad advice, but I've heard this as bad advice from others. And so you don't have to just trust my word on it. You got the Bible's word on it here. If you do not loan money to family members, don't loan money to friends. You do that and you're going to create a wedge in the relationship. You might do that because you think you're helping them. But it's not going to go well in your friendship. It's the relationship is going to pay. I was actually just talking to Gary about that last week. He was sharing with me and his testimony about that and how he refused to give a loan at a time. Do you know what I'm saying, Gary? You recall? Yeah, he might. I got to jog his memory later tonight. But he was sharing that with me just last week about how he goes, I wouldn't give money or do something because I didn't want to affect the relationship. And it will. If you loan money, now you can give money. Of course, you can give money away. But don't loan money. Don't enter into contracts with friends. It will not go well. It will not increase your friendship. It will actually destroy the friendship. And a true friend, understands this. I'm there with my friend. I'm going to help him. I might give him money. I'm not going to loan him money. I'm not going to enter into a debt with him. In verse 19, he loves transgression that loves strife, and he that exalts his gate seeks destruction. Now this exalting of the gate, in all the commentaries that I read, it speaks of somebody who is making their house look beautiful to show how wealthy they are when really they're not that rich. That's what it's talking about. It is wearing all the finest clothes to make yourself look like you're rich when really you don't have that much money. You might actually be in debt, but you're going further into debt to buy cars that you can't afford or to buy houses you can't afford. And here's the thing. He says, whoever is exalting his gate seeks destruction. Whoever would would lift themselves up in their stature and status to look wealthier than they really are, the Bible is saying is going to result in destruction. It's not wise. A way we put this in terms of today is live beneath your means. Anybody ever hear that saying, live beneath your means? Nobody's ever heard that. Okay. Living beneath your means is the amount of money that you have. So if you make us, say, $50,000 a year, don't spend more than $50,000 a year. This is rocket science, I know. But live beneath your means. And this is the principle this is getting at. Verse 20, he that has a froward heart finds no good, and he that has a perverse tongue falls into mischief. Fix the heart and the tongue first. Fix the heart and the tongue. But if we fixed our heart and our tongue, it would result in a different outcome in our lives. This is getting to it. Out of the heart come evil things, and it comes up out of the mouth through our tongue. So we need to address our tongue, and we need to address our hearts. In verse 21, it says, he that begets a fool doeth it to his sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy. Now, I mentioned earlier in verse 6 about what a blessing children are. And they are the crown of old men, and children are a blessing. They are always a blessing, children are. But children can also be a grief. Now, they're not a curse. Do not get me wrong. Children are a blessing, but they can also be a grief if they are not found in the way of righteousness. It says, whoever begets a fool, it brings sorrow to himself. If you raise a fool as a child, it will bring grief to your soul. It's going to bring grief upon you. I mean, the father of a fool, it says, has no joy. And there's actually another verse, we'll come all the way down to verse 25. It says, a foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her that bare him. A foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to his mom. So we need to be raising our children for Christ. We need to pay attention to how we raise our children, because they will be raised one day. And once they're raised, we can't change them. We can pray for them, but you can't change them anymore. They've got their own will, and they might sow their wild oats their whole life, and to bring grief to your soul your whole life. So the way we raise our children is important. I think of this every day with my children. You know what? These are the impressionable years for them. I've got to make them count. But even if your children are 10, you still are influencing them. You still have power over them. 15, they're in your house. You're still influencing them. But when you launch them out, we've lost that opportunity. So there's a warning here. The warning is not, don't have kids because they might bring grief to you. That's not the warning. You've misunderstood Scripture if that's the warning. It's told us how special it is to have kids, and it will always be special to have kids. But pay attention to how you're raising them. Pay attention, even now, if you've got grown-up children, to how you are mentoring your children, raising them. Pay attention to that. If we neglect that, it comes back to us. It's not just a consequence on them. It's a consequence on us, and we feel it. In verse 22, it says, a merry heart does good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. Now, it's interesting. The verse prior is a depressing one, isn't it? And now it talks about being happy. It shares a depressing verse and then says, be happy. A merry heart makes good like a medicine. So actually, happiness is good medicine to your soul. And you know what? If we were more happy, we would probably be at the doctor's less. And I think, honestly, the doctors know this. I honestly think they know, and they try to make us as sad as possible. That's why they keep us in waiting rooms for 9 hours. They want to keep us as sick as possible so that we just keep coming back. That's why they make us scared of getting needles and all these things, right? They know got to keep the business coming. But merry heart, actually, scientifically speaking, laughing is really good for our bodies. And I can't go into the depths, but just a few things I read. When you laugh, it actually fills your lungs, chambers of your lungs, with oxygen that aren't normally filled, which is really healthy for your lungs, and which is also in turn really healthy for your brain, because your brain needs oxygen. But also, when you laugh, your lungs will vibrate sideways, and it massages your heart, and your heart loves it. It's a heart massage, which you just can't do without laughing. So those are just two areas I've learned about that laughing. Both of these things will extend your life. They'll increase your blood flow. They'll increase your health. Laughing, make no mistake, laugh and laugh often because it's super healthy to do. But it also says a broken spirit, what does it do? It dries out your bones. Depression, we've already talked about this in a previous proverb, but depression makes the heart sick. And here we see a broken spirit, it dries out your bones. It will make your bones weak and decay. So this is some good medical advice from God. I think he knows what he's doing. He designed the body. It's amazing how he's designed our bodies to enjoy laughter and how important it even is that we are laughing. In verse 23, it says, a wicked man takes a gift out of the bosom to pervert the ways of judgment. And here we have bribery in a negative sense, in a very negative sense. This is the way we normally think of bribery, is somebody who is taking a gift to pervert justice. Think of bribing an officer, right? You know, you don't want to get that fine or penalty, so you might slip them some money, and they probably wouldn't take it because they've got strong codes of conduct. But that's the idea, right? You're bribing the officer to get off without the charge, and but here, interestingly, the guilt is more on the person receiving the bribe than the person giving it. Now, in our laws today, if you go to bribe an RCMP officer, you will get a penalty. It's illegal to do that. You cannot bribe it. But here it doesn't address the person offering the bribe. It addresses the person receiving a bribe. It says here, a wicked man takes a gift out of the bosom to pervert the ways of judgment. Now, it's probably wicked both ways, but it's highlighting how wicked it is if you actually would receive a gift and it would influence your decision. If you are receiving money, if you're receiving something to distort your judgment in any way, you are wicked. It's no good. In verse 24, wisdom is before him that has understanding, but the eyes of a fool are in the ends of the earth. Where does the fool look to? The ends of the earth. He's looking off into the future. He's looking off to someday, somewhere far away. He's dreaming about the future. He's fantasizing. Do you know what? The future doesn't exist. Did you know that? The future doesn't exist. The future is just a fantasy. What actually happens in the future may be or may not be what you think. But your thoughts about the future are a fantasy. And so the fool lives in fantasy. The wise person lives thinking, it says, the wisdom is before him that hath understanding. That means he's thinking about his next step. The wise person lives in the present, and there's a great book you should read. You all know C.S. Lewis. Read C.S. Lewis' book, The Screwtape Letters. And in it, it's a beautiful little book. And but in here, it gives us the picture that Satan would rather us think about the future and forget about the present. And if he can't get us to think about the future, he'll get us to dwell about our past. But he cannot have us living in the present, because it's in the present that every good thing happens. If we're living in the future, dreaming about what's going to happen next year, or we're living in the past about what we did, either the glory days or the shame of the past, he's keeping us from our attention being in the present, which is where it should be. Our attention should always be in the present. Don't mistake attention in the present for neglecting the future. Having your attention in the present is the best way to prepare for the future. Those who are preparing for the future, make no mistake, are focused on the present. People who are focused on the future never get prepared. Those who are focused on the present, I think of it this way, okay? My wife and I have a garden, and we want to gather all this food in to have food for the winter. Okay, we're thinking about the future in the sense of we want to be prepared for it. But how are we going to be best prepared? By every day thinking about what do I need to do today, get the crops in, get the ground watered, right? We're very focused on today, what needs to be done so that we can be prepared. And this is how the wise are. Think about your life today. This is the only day that exists. The past is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Do you realize that? The past does not exist anymore. It's gone. The future doesn't exist and probably will never exist. But this moment right now exists. And so Satan will keep us away from that if he can. In verse 25, a foolish son is a grief to his father. Oh, okay, I already read this one. Verse 26, also to punish the just is not good, nor to strike princes for equity. We should not be punishing those who do right. We punish evildoers. And it's not good. It says to strike princes for equity means to punish or resist righteous rulers. When we have righteous rulers, whether they be kings, elders and pastors, fathers in homes, These are the rulers, right? This is God's order of hierarchy. Whatever they be, if we have a righteous ruler, do not resist them. They might get things wrong, granted, but don't resist the righteous ruler. God's put them there for a purpose. Do not punish the just and do not resist the righteous. In verse 27, he that hath knowledge spares his words, and a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. In verse 28, even a fool, when he holds his peace, is counted wise, and he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding. Calm and collected is the man of understanding. He has few words and communicates clearly. That's ironic, isn't it? Isn't that ironic? I can't finish the sentence as I'm reading about communicating clearly. The more words we have, the less we know. And there's another proverb that bears this witness. In the multitude of words, sin is not lacking. And so the wise person has fewer words, they've thought it through, and they know how to answer properly.